Eagles co-founder Glenn Frey. So many celebrating the rock and roll legend this morning. He passed away at the age of 67, and ABC's Chris Connolly takes a look back at his incredible contribution to the music world.
In 2016, a legend passed away, leaving the music world reeling. Glenn Frey, as a co-founder of the iconic rock band Eagles, helped define a generation. Fans and fellow musicians mourned deeply. However, one voice remained noticeably quiet, and that's Don Henley's. The whole world was stunned when Henley broke his silence. It was heartfelt. Despite their complicated and once a controversial relationship, what Henley revealed changed how we remember both the man and their music. A powerhouse duo. It's impossible to separate the story of Don Henley and Glenn Frey. When you look at the history of the Eagles, they were the two powerhouse songwriters, the voices behind the band's biggest hits, and the leaders who built one of the most successful rock bands in history. But they were also two very different people, two strong personalities who often clashed as much as they collaborated. Their relationship was, by all accounts, complicated. They weren't best friends in the traditional sense, and they often didn't see eye to eye. Still, they built a musical empire together. And when Glenn Frey died, it was Don Henley who perhaps felt the loss more deeply than anyone, reflecting not just on the music, but on decades of tangled friendship, creative tension, and shared legacy. Their partnership began in the early 70s in Los Angeles after both men had been hired as part of Linda Ronstadt's backing band. They hit it off musically and decided to form their own band, something that would blend rock, country, and folk into something new. That band became the Eagles. From the start, Henley and Frey were the creative engine. Frey was the more extroverted of the two, ambitious, confident, and laser-focused on success. He had a sharp instinct for what made a good song and a commercial hit. Henley, on the other hand, was more reserved and intellectual. He brought poetic lyrics, depth, and a kind of seriousness to the music that balanced Frey's more grounded, radio-ready sensibilities. In many ways, they were a perfect yin and yang. Frey once described their working relationship like this: "I learned a lot from Don Henley. He's a deep thinker. I'm more of a doer." Together, they wrote or co-wrote nearly all of the Eagles' biggest songs, including Hotel California, Desperado, One of These Nights, and Life in the Fast Lane. Frey often handled the big-picture production and arrangements, while Henley zeroed in on the lyrics and thematic content. It worked spectacularly, but it also led to tension. As the band became more successful, Henley and Frey's grip on the group tightened. They were referred to, half jokingly and half resignedly, by the other band members as the Gods. The nickname was born out of a very real shift in power. Frey and Henley had become the undisputed leaders of the Eagles, often making decisions about songwriting, credits, money, tours, and who stayed or left the band. This power dynamic bred resentment among other members like Don Felder, Bernie Leadon, and Randy Meisner, who felt their voices and contributions were being minimized. And, truthfully, it wasn't just the rest of the band who had issues. Henley and Frey often clashed with each other too. They had different personalities and ways of working. Frey could be pushy, assertive, and focused on the business side. Henley was intense, perfectionistic, and deeply protective of the artistic integrity of their music. As the years wore on, the pressure to maintain success and keep the band together started to wear on. Both of them. Arguments in the studio were common. Disagreements about song, direction, album delays, and control over the band's image created tension that sometimes spilled into outright hostility. By the time they were working on The Long Run, 1979, the atmosphere was toxic. This creative process had slowed to a crawl, and personal tensions were boiling over. A breaking point came during a benefit concert in Long Beach in 1980, where Glenn Frey and guitarist Don Felder got into a verbal fight on stage that nearly turned physical. Backstage, Henley was fed up with the infighting, and shortly after, the band broke up. During those years apart, Frey and Henley didn't talk much. In interviews, there was often a sense of distance, even subtle jabs. But they both understood that together they had created something timeless and something bigger than their egos. When they reunited in 1994 for the Hell Freezes Over tour, it was a major moment. The name of the tour itself was a tongue-in-cheek nod to their previous insistence that the band would only reunite. When hell freezes over. They still had creative differences, but they had grown up. Their working relationship matured into something more respectful, even if the old friction never fully disappeared. Glenn's death proved something about the real relationship between him and Don, and no one expected Don's words. When Glenn Frey passed away on January 18, 2016, the world lost more than just a founding member of the Eagles. It lost a musical architect whose songwriting and performing helped define a generation. For Don Henley, Frey's death was not only a public tragedy, but a deeply personal loss. The two men shared over 4 decades of friendship, collaboration, and creative partnership. In the wake of Frey's death, Henley released a heartfelt statement that reflected the gravity of his grief and the enduring bond between them. He described Frey as the one who started it all, the driving force behind the Eagles, and his brother in music. Henley's words revealed more than sorrow. They reflected respect, admiration, and a quiet understanding of the fragility of time. He spoke of their early days as young musicians in Los Angeles, driven and hungry, trying to forge something lasting. They did more than that. They created a legacy. Henley's tone was not bitter, but reverent. He acknowledged the creative tensions that sometimes arose between them, but framed these moments as part of a larger, richer tapestry of shared experiences. His reflection hinted at the kind of partnership that is as rare as it is powerful, built on trust, tested by time, and ultimately cemented by mutual belief in the music they made together. What makes Henley's reflection especially poignant is the maturity with which he viewed their journey. Rather than dwelling on past conflicts or nostalgia alone, he chose to honor Frey's contributions and character. He called him a man with a great sense of humor, a keen intellect, and a passion for life. It's clear that Henley saw Frey not only as a bandmate, but as a kind of mirror, someone who shaped and challenged him, and whose absence would be felt in every note that followed. In the quiet aftermath, Henley carried not just memories, but the weight of continuing the legacy they built, a responsibility he seemed to accept with grace and deep gratitude. Frey's death marked the end of an era for the Eagles, and Henley acknowledged this with a solemn finality. He stated that the band was finished after Frey's passing, underscoring how integral Frey had been to its identity. Though the Eagles eventually continued in a new form, Henley's initial reaction speaks volumes about the depth of their connection. His tribute was not merely for a fellow musician, it was for a lifelong companion in the artistic endeavor, a brother whose presence helped shape his own voice. In losing Glenn Frey, Henley lost a part of himself. Glenn is Glenn and forever will be Don's brother. Glenn and life. It's easy to jump straight to his time with the Eagles. Songs like Hotel California and Lion, Eyes, the sunglasses, the California cool when you hear the name Glenn Frey. But if you rewind the tape far enough, you'll find a kid growing up in the working-class suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, far from the palm trees and sunshine of Los Angeles. Glenn Lewis Frey was born on November 6, 1948 in Detroit and raised in Royal Oak, a quiet little town that had a bit of that typical post-World War II American vibe. His dad, Edward Frey, worked in a factory management position at General Motors, and his mom, Nellie, stayed home to raise Glenn and manage the household. She had a musical side to her too, playing piano around the house and planting the first seeds of Glenn's future love for music. Growing up in Royal Oak was a mix of routine and freedom. It wasn't flashy or particularly artistic, but it was solid. Glenn was a curious and energetic kid, the kind who didn't sit still for long. He was into sports as much as music, and he had a bit of a mischievous streak. Nothing wild, but enough to keep things interesting. He went to Dondero High School, a typical suburban high school where he didn't exactly fit the mold of a model student. Academics weren't really his thing. He wasn't failing out or anything, but it was clear his passions were elsewhere. He was always more into what was happening outside the classroom than inside it. Music was already starting to take hold of him, and by the time he hit his teenage years, that interest had turned into a full-blown obsession. Glenn's first real musical experiences came through the piano. His mom encouraged him to play, and for a while, he took lessons like a lot of kids do. But he wasn't content to just play what was on the sheet music. He wanted to make it his own. Eventually, he picked up the guitar, an instrument that let him feel more connected to the rock and roll that was starting to dominate the airwaves. The Beatles were a huge influence, like they were for almost every teenager in the 60s. But Glenn was also listening to Elvis Presley, Chuck, Berry, and Little Richard. And being from Detroit, he had Motown all around him. The Temptations, the Four Tops, Marvin Gaye. That blend of rock and soul would become part of his musical DNA. By high school, Glenn had joined a few local bands, including one called the Subterraneans and later another named The Four of Us. These groups played gigs at school dances, teen clubs, and local events, covering songs by the Beatles, Rolling, Stones, and other British invasion acts. It was fun, sure, but Glenn was also serious about it. He wanted to get better. He wasn't just playing for the attention or the girls. He genuinely loved the craft. And while a lot of kids were thinking about college or trade school, Glenn was thinking about amps, lyrics, and studio sessions. After graduating from Dondero High in 1966, Glenn did something that felt a little more conventional. He enrolled at Oakland Community College. But school wasn't where his heart was. He stuck it out briefly, but it became clear that college wasn't going to be his path. Instead, he threw himself deeper into Detroit's rock scene, which was buzzing with energy. That's where he crossed paths with Bob Seger, who was already starting to make a name for himself in the Midwest. Sager took Glenn under his wing, not in a formal mentor kind of way, but enough to give him some crucial experience. In 1968, Glenn played acoustic guitar and sang background vocals on Seeger's hit Ramblin' Gamblin' Man. That was Glenn's first real taste of success, his first time on a record that got serious radio play. It wasn't his song, but it gave him a glimpse of what could be possible. Still, Detroit could only take him so far. The music industry wasn't centered there, and Glenn had dreams way too big to be confined to Michigan. So, like many hopeful artists of that era, he packed up and headed west to Los Angeles. It was the late 60s, and L.A. was bursting with creativity. Bands like the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, and the Mamas and Papas. The Papas were rewriting the rules of American music. Glenn landed in the thick of it, broke but determined. He bounced between cheap apartments, sometimes sleeping on couches, sometimes living with other musicians. One of the key relationships he formed early on was with J.D. Souther, another aspiring songwriter. The two became roommates, formed a duo called Long Branch Pennywhistle, and started playing gigs around town. They blended country, rock, and folk in a way that was still new at the time, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the California sound. Even though he wasn't a household name yet, Glenn's instincts were sharp. He kept making connections, hanging around the Troubadour Club where everyone from Linda Ronstadt to Jackson Browne was performing. In fact, it was through his work with Ronstadt that he met Don Henley. The two would soon form the core of the Eagles, but none of that was a given back then. Glenn was still hustling, playing backup, writing songs, and figuring it out as he went. In Frey's early life, it's clear that he wasn't an overnight success. He was a kid from a regular town, raised in a solid family, who just happened to fall in love with music and chase it like his life depended on it. His education didn't come from college textbooks. It came from the piano in his mom's living room, the records spinning on his turntable, the garage band rehearsals, and the tiny clubs in Detroit and L.A. where he learned what it meant to be a real musician. His story is about persistence, passion, and the long road to becoming one of rock's most enduring voices. Not in a snap, but eventually he became big in his career. Part of a legacy. Frey's career wasn't just successful, it was legendary. As one of the founding members of the Eagles, he helped shape the sound of American rock in the 70s, blending country, rock, and folk in a way that hadn't really been done before. His influence was felt, not just through the music, but also through the culture around it. Frey had this charisma that made people want to listen, whether he was singing about taking it easy on the road or about heartache and love gone wrong. His voice had this warm, raspy quality that was instantly recognizable, and it made you feel like he was telling your story. He wasn't doing it alone, of course. Frey co-founded the Eagles with Don Henley, Bernie, Lee Don, and Randy Meisner. From the beginning, Glenn was sort of the unofficial leader of the band. He had a strong vision and was deeply involved in songwriting and production. Songs like Take It Easy, which he co-wrote with Jackson Browne, Tequila, Sunrise, and Peaceful Easy Feeling became instant classics. He had this amazing ability to write songs that felt personal, even universal, and that's part of what made him so loved by fans. What's even more impressive is that after the Eagles broke up in 1980, Frey didn't slow down. He jumped right into a solo career, and kept making hits. Songs like The Heat Is On, which was featured in Beverly Hills Cop, and You Belong to the City from Miami. Vice showed that he could still capture that same magic on his own. He brought his rock roots into the world of pop and TV soundtracks, and people ate it up. His solo work had a bit more of a slick urban feel, but it still had that classic Frey honesty and coolness. One of the big reasons people loved Glenn Frey so much was his authenticity. He wasn't trying to be anyone else. What you saw was what you got. His songs came from a real place, and you could hear that in every line he sang. He also had this cool, confident stage presence. He wasn't flashy or over the top, but he had that California swagger that just worked. Whether he was front and center or playing rhythm guitar in the background, he always seemed totally in control. As earlier mentioned, there was his partnership with Don Henley, which was the backbone of the Eagles. The two of them balanced each other out. Frey was more of the grounded, practical one, while Henley brought a more introspective, poetic vibe. Together, they created some of the most enduring music in rock history. Their songwriting chemistry was rare and incredibly effective. Frey wasn't just a musician either. He dipped his toes into acting and had appearances in shows like Miami Vice, and even had a small role in the movie Jerry Maguire. That crossover into pop culture helped expand his fan base even more. He was always working, always creating, and always pushing forward. Band of the Century. The Eagles are one of those rare bands that transcend generations, genres, and even personal tastes. Whether you're a die-hard classic rock fan or someone who just hums along to the radio on long drives, chances are you've heard and enjoyed at least one Eagles song. That's the kind of reach and staying power this band has. Eagles started out as a backup band for Linda Ronstadt. Who would have guessed back then that these musicians would go on to become one of the most successful and iconic bands in American music history? From the very beginning, the Eagles stood out because of their perfect blend of rock, country, and folk influences. They weren't trying to be flashy or overly experimental. Their music was rooted in storytelling and melody. Songs like Take It Easy and Peaceful, Easy Feeling captured the carefree, sun-soaked California vibe of the early 70s. Their harmonies were tight, their guitar work clean but soulful, and their lyrics struck a chord with everyday people. They sang about things that felt real: heartbreak, confusion, longing, and the bittersweet feeling of growing up and facing the world. As the band evolved, so did their sound. Albums like Desperado, On the Border, and One of these nights started to show more depth, with songs that were richer in emotion and more musically complex. They weren't afraid to mix country-style ballads with harder, edged rock songs, and by the time Hotel California dropped in 1976, the Eagles had reached their peak, both in terms of creativity and commercial success. That album didn't just go multi-platinum. It became a cultural touchstone. The title track is still widely considered one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded. It's mysterious, haunting, and full of metaphor, and that guitar solo, absolutely legendary. What's interesting about the Eagles is that they weren't some overnight success story that fizzled out. They were strategic and professional, treating their band like a business as much as a creative outlet. This meant constant touring, high production values, and a lot of hard work behind the scenes. But it also led to tension. The band's inner dynamics were famously rocky, pun intended. Members clashed over songwriting, control, and the general stress of fame. Don Henley and Glenn Frey were often seen as the leaders, but others like Joe Walsh, Randy Meisner, and Don Felder all had major contributions and strong personalities of their own. Eventually, the tension boiled over, and the band broke up in 1980. For many fans, that breakup felt like the end of an era. But the Eagles weren't quite done. In fact, they became even more legendary during their hiatus. Their greatest hits album, from 1976, their greatest hits, 1971 to 1975, continued selling in huge numbers, to the point where it's one of the best-selling albums of all time, right up there with Michael Jackson's Thriller. That's no small feat for a band that wasn't even active for over a decade. Then came the big surprise. In 1994, the Eagles reunited for the Hell Freezes Over tour, the name a cheeky reference to past comments that they'd only reunite when, well, hell froze over. The tour was a massive success. Not only did it sell out venues around the world, but it also introduced a whole new generation to their music. The live album from that tour, also titled Hell Freezes Over, featured new tracks alongside live versions of classics, reminding everyone that the Eagles still had it: the harmonies, the musicianship, the magic. In the years that followed, the Eagles continued to tour and even released new music, including the 2007 album Long Road Out of Eden, which proved they still had something to say. The album was more reflective and political, showing how their songwriting had matured, and fans appreciated that. They weren't just chasing nostalgia. The Eagles had grown older, and so had their audience. Yet the emotional resonance of their music never faded. Sadly, Glenn Frey passed away, a huge loss, not just for the band, but for rock music in general. Many thought this might finally be the end of the Eagles, but in a move that felt both heartfelt and symbolic, the band brought in Glenn's son, Deacon Frey, to help fill the void. Along with Vince Gill, they kept the music alive, continuing to tour and honor the legacy that had been built over decades. This decision was met with overwhelming support from fans, who saw it as a beautiful way to carry the torch forward. Today, the Eagles aren't just remembered, they're celebrated. Their influence stretches far beyond their own songs. You would agree only a few classic bands have captured the hearts of the young generations now, correct? You can hear traces of their sound in country music, soft rock, Americana, and even indie. Artists like Keith Urban, Taylor Swift, and John Mayer have all cited them as an influence, in one way or another. Their ability to write simple, relatable, yet deeply emotional songs is a craft that's been studied and admired by musicians for years. But maybe the most powerful thing about the Eagles' legacy is the emotional connection they've built with fans. Their songs aren't just good, they mean something. Desperado can make you feel vulnerable. Lion Eyes makes you think about betrayal and truth. Take It to the Limit speaks to anyone who's ever felt stuck between chasing their dreams and playing it safe. These aren't just songs, they're life moments set to music. That kind of impact doesn't fade. It grows with time. When the band disbanded. So, when the Eagles officially broke up in 1980, it didn't exactly come as a shock to anyone paying attention. The tensions within the band had been building for a long time. Creative clashes, personal rivalries, non-stop touring, and just the general stress of being One of the biggest bands in the world had taken its toll. There were even moments during their final shows where members were threatening each other on stage. So, when they finally went their separate ways, it felt less like a sudden breakup and more like a long, overdue cooling-off period. But just because the band was done, at least for the time being, didn't mean the music stopped. In fact, the years after the breakup saw several members carving out their own solo paths, some wildly successful, some more under the radar, but all part of the continuing story of the Eagles. Don Henley probably had the most successful solo career after the split. He didn't waste any time. By the early 80s, he was already putting out solo records that made a big splash. His 1984 album, Building the Perfect Beast, was a huge hit, with songs like The Boys of Summer becoming staples of the decade. That song in particular showed a more introspective and moody side of Henley's songwriting, but it still had that same lyrical depth that made Eagles' songs so powerful. He followed it up with The End of the Innocents in 1989, another critical and commercial success. Henley's solo work felt like a natural evolution of the Eagles' sound, just with more of a personal and political edge. He also became pretty vocal about artists' rights and the changing music industry. Clearly, he never stopped thinking deeply about the role of music in the world. Joe Walsh, the wild card of the group, was already an established solo artist before he even joined the Eagles. He had success with the James Gang and with his solo work, like the classic Rocky Mountain Way. So when the band split, he just kept doing his thing. Walsh released several solo albums in the 80s and 90s, and while they didn't all break records, they kept his name in the rock scene. His guitar skills never faded, and he remained a beloved figure, not just for his playing, but for his quirky personality and offbeat sense of humor. He also struggled with substance abuse during this time, something he's talked about openly, but he eventually got sober and continued playing music well into the 2000s. As for the other members like Timothy B. Schmidt and Don Felder, they took different paths. Schmidt, who had joined the Eagles in the later years, continued to be an in-demand session musician and released some solo material of his own. His smooth voice and bass playing made him a valuable collaborator, and he stayed active even if he wasn't always in the spotlight. Don Felder, on the other hand, had a rougher time post-Eagles. He got caught up in legal battles with other band members over royalties and credits, especially during and after the 1994 reunion. Still, he remained a respected guitarist and eventually released a memoir in 2008 called Heaven and Hell: My Life in the Eagles, which pulled back the curtain on some of the drama behind the scenes. Randy Meisner, the original bassist and high tenor voice on hits like Take It to the Limit, had a much more low-key life after the split. He released a few solo albums and did some touring, but mostly stayed out of the public eye. His post-Eagles years were more private and, unfortunately, filled with personal struggles and health issues. He was deeply talented, but didn't seem to chase the limelight the way some of the others did. It's a reminder that not everyone from a famous band wants or thrives in a solo spotlight. What's interesting about all these solo careers is that no matter how far the members wandered musically, there was always a sense of unfinished business, a feeling that the Eagles' story wasn't quite over. And sure enough, in 1994, they shocked the world by getting back together for the Hell Freezes Over tour. It was a huge moment, not just because people never thought they'd reunite, but because they came back better than expected. The tour was a blockbuster, and the live performances proved that even after all the tension and time apart, the chemistry was still there. They weren't just playing the old hits, they were reclaiming them. Were or are you a fan of the Eagles too? What's your favorite Eagles song? Tell us in the section below. Also, subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories like this.